My name is Dustin Arendit. I'm a research scientist at the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, and that's in Washington State. You can blame my accent if you need to on Virginia, which is in the east coast of the U.S. And so today you're going to hear about storyline visualization, and specifically how do we apply this, I suppose, new technique to the data that we've just been thinking about, but specifically the mini challenge 2 data. So I have several perhaps unrealistic goals for the talk. This is going to be a technical talk, so depending on your level of expertise, you'll either get a lot out of it or maybe not so much. But I think if you have an interest in graph theory, you'll love this talk. I'll talk about graph layout algorithms. If you have an interest in visualization and design, I talk about some design alternatives. If you have an interest in data science and analytics, a good chunk of this talk will be about that. And if you like cool pictures, then you'll like this talk too. And if you like all of those things, then you're probably me. Okay. So the original inspiration for essentially all of the modern work on storyline visualization comes from this webcomic. So by a show of hands, how many people have seen this before? Oh, that's awesome. Okay, cool. So what we're trying to do essentially is take data and automatically generate visualizations that look like this. And why do we want to do that? Well, what do you like about this visualization? So anyone who's seen this before, can someone speak up and say something that they really like about it? That makes it different? Sure. Yeah, you want. So you can clearly tell that the sort of dynamics of this movie is severely different than the rest. Yeah. So I'll just say, since maybe it's late in the evening, what I like about it is that I think it captures a lot of really complex things in a very simple way, and it just communicates that extremely easily. You don't have to be an expert in visualization to understand it. I think everybody who sees it instantly gets it. That paragraph at the top is redundant, but it says these charts show movie character interactions. The horizontal axis is time, and the vertical grouping of the lines indicate which characters are together at a given time. And so it's using sort of that gestalt property of shared fate, or birds of a feather flock together, to communicate that. And that's something that we inherently understand as people. So this is super cool. And essentially that's what some of the research that I've been thinking about for the past 3 or 4 years is dealing with. So how do we generate this automatically from data? Obviously this was hand-drawn by the artist Randall Munro, but maybe he used some software to assist him, but we want to be able to do this automatically. Okay. So the remainder of my talk is basically broken up into 3 sections. It's very helpful to think about the related work in this area. There's not a lot. It's not like parallel coordinates where you have multiple papers every year coming out about parallel coordinates. There's probably only a half dozen important papers on this topic. And so I'll go through those, and I'll go through other research that is sort of broadly related to this, but maybe slightly different design alternatives. So after the related work, I'll talk about the analytics behind this. So these visualizations assume a very structured form of data, and it's almost guaranteed that the data that's required to create a storyline visualization is not the same, really, as the data that you start with. So how do we take arbitrary data that we're given, in this case multivariate time series, which I'll explain what that means a little later, but GPS data is a multivariate time series, specifically collections of multivariate time series. How do we take that and transform it into something that is compatible with a storyline visualization? And then I'll talk about the layout and design alternatives that you can use. So once you have your data in the proper format, there's actually quite a lot of choices that you can make about how to actually visualize this data. So let's start talking about related work. So this is a fairly important paper, and it's probably not the first paper to really talk about this concept, but tends to be highly cited for some reason. And it's talking about this idea of a space-time cube. And so a space-time cube is a pretty straightforward idea. You have 2-dimensional trajectories that you want to understand over time, so you make the 3rd dimension time. And then there are various issues, like the fact that you've now separated that timeline from the actual geospatial context, so you want to draw, let's see if I can point here, no, I can't point. you draw these like little integrating lines to show what it actually corresponds to on the map. And you can overlay multiple things on here, and it lets you see if things are actually co-located. So if they're the same place at the same time, they'll intersect in this 3D space. And that's something that can be hard to see in a visualization in 2 dimensions, because they might be at the same place but at different times, and so it may be completely unimportant. So these folks kind of predate the storyline viz a little bit, and what they're doing here is they're recognizing that 3rd dimension really just messes things up. Okay, we don't want to do that. InfoViz is 2-dimensional, in my opinion. So we want to somehow take these trajectories and project them down to 2 dimensions. And the way they do that is using principal components analysis. They just run PCA on the 2-dimensional points, treating each, let's say, GPS sample as an independent sample, project this data down to 2 dimensions. And so the horizontal axis is time, and the vertical axis is the primary principal component. And it kind of works. But I think we can do better. Along these lines is this work, which came out actually this year in VASS. So I remember seeing this paper. And basically what they do is they run multidimensional scaling basically in time windows independently. So you kind of get this one-dimensional spreading out of your data points based on similarity. And then for each time window, they kind of line it up and put things around and move it around so that they are roughly getting some kind of meaningful trend over time. But the fact that I think this is done independently in each time window is not good. Potentially worse than the previous approach that we saw, where the y-coordinate actually has consistent meaning over time. In this case, it doesn't, and I think that is actually not good. This is a case where they did multidimensional scaling and combined it with time, but they did do that scaling across the entire time interval. And so there is a meaning to the y-coordinate in this case. And so being constant there does actually mean that you have constant behavior in some sense. And they're using this to understand eye tracking data over time. So they ran participants through the same condition. They watched a movie about, it looks like whitewater rafting, and watch where people's eyes are going, and they're interested in determining whether 2 people are looking at the same thing at the same time or not. Okay. So then we also have essentially the core of the storyline visualization research, and these focus on the layout algorithms. And essentially from this, we've learned that there are sort of 3 aesthetic criteria that you want to optimize, and those are crossings, wiggles, and white space. And I'll define those later. But for now, you can assume that this sort of Star Wars visualization from the original comic is the inspiration for all this work. And they're all trying to kind of mimic this. And many of the early works actually cite this comic and put it in the paper, too. I hope they got permission to do that. OK, so one of the original works came out in 2010 out of Jeff Hare's group. And it talks about visualizing family trees using storylines. Now, one of the disadvantages of this technique, even though it does produce really nice visualizations, nice clean layouts, is that there's a certain assumption about the structure of what we're visualizing that makes it easy to lay out, but it's not generalizable. So you can't take their algorithm and visualize an arbitrary set of interactions. You can only do it with this special structured data. So about the same time, also in 2010, this paper came out of Kwan-Lu Ma's group at UC Davis. And now these don't look as nice, but their algorithm is actually more general. So for a more general set of interactions, this will work. And the way that they accomplished this was through a genetic algorithm. So who's heard of genetic algorithms before? Okay. You probably know that they're really slow, and they don't really give you a lot of insight. You basically just write down what you want the solution to work, and it chugs away, and you get something, and it's probably better than the other things that it tried, but yeah, okay. So lots of room for improvement here, too. So following this, also out of Kwan-Lu Ma's group, but with a different main contributor to the project, was probably the first really good storyline layout algorithm. And you can see in the paper they cite Star Wars, and they're essentially trying to exactly reproduce the webcomic. And they compared it against the existing technique that I showed in the previous slide. And this was one of the first algorithms that actually ran quickly too. So this was a pretty big upgrade in terms of the state of the art. It runs much faster, probably several orders of magnitude faster, and produces much better layouts. Immediately preceding that, this approach came out of Xie Liu's group in China, and they also are really interested in reproducing these XKCD comics. They basically use that as the benchmark to how close they can get to it. And the interesting thing that came out of this research was sort of hierarchical constraints on what the visualization could do. So I think that's shown here, yeah. And so in the bottom two, they're actually comparing their technique against the previous technique that I showed you. And what you can see, or not, perhaps, is that in the previous technique, the storylines could actually be placed in a way that didn't make sense. So they're showing the movie Inception here, and so they're basically showing that something that would confuse the user or the reader about the physical location of places. So like the storyline for one place could be placed inside another pair of storylines that were about a second place. And so they have these hierarchical constraints that you can specify that prevent that from happening. So that's interesting, and I think that's a good thought to consider when doing this. This year at VIS, we had this research as well by the same group out of UC Davis and the same first author. And essentially, their contribution was an even faster algorithm. I think it's roughly as fast as the previous work that I showed. It renders the storylines in seconds, roughly, and has a pretty good layout. The other main contribution of this work was that it works in a streaming context. So the storyline can be built incrementally. So previous to this, all of the storylines required all of the data up front, and it would create one image. And in this case, it's online or incremental. So as new data comes in, the visualization updates, but it preserves the user's mental map by keeping everything that it's already rendered in roughly the same configuration, which I think is very helpful too. So that's roughly it for storyline visualization algorithms in the past work. But storyline-like visualizations have been used to understand dynamic graphs. So I'm going to give you like a one minute, maybe a 30-second introduction to dynamic graphs. So dynamic graphs are actually incredibly important because data that's modeled with graphs tends to change over time, because usually we're modeling phenomena or something like that. And so what you can do is you can take a snapshot of your data, model it as a single graph, but then you could take another snapshot at another time, and so on and so forth. So we'll have a whole sequence of these relationships that we want to understand. And it's very, very challenging to understand how that network is changing over time. So in this case, I've applied Louvain clustering, which is basically just a technique to detect dense clusters or dense groups of nodes in the graph. I've applied this independently to each graph here. And the reason that you'd want to do that is because Louvain clustering is something that, or clustering in general or community detection, is something that is typically used in network analysis as sort of a first pass to break things up into chunks. So when you do this independently, and the colors are assigned completely randomly each time, you can see that there are these chunks of things, but the colors don't necessarily correspond. And so it's really hard to understand what's actually changing. And then on top of that, we have too many nodes to assign nodes individual colors. So I've assigned the numbers, but they're also really hard to trace what's going on. There's a whole body of work in the literature that talks about dynamic graph visualization and all the tasks that you'd want to do and various techniques that you'd want to do. So I'm not really going to get into that, but what I will get into is solutions to this that are based on storyline visualization. So the first solution that came out of the literature is this one. It's kind of based on that space-time cube. You've got the space-time cube on the left. But then on the right, what we have are what's called dynamic communities. And basically what we're doing is we're running that community detection algorithm to break the graph up into separate chunks. And then we're showing how the nodes move from one community to another over time. And those communities are just stacked up in this vertical layer in some order. I don't really know how they chose the order. And you just draw the line as the node moves from one community to the other. And this work actually builds on some previous work, which was some of the original techniques created for doing dynamic network analysis and dynamic community detection in networks. This is work that I did a while back using storylines to visualize a protein interaction network. So this is actually a cell cycle, what governs how cells multiply and divide. Yeah, I guess that analogy works. So there's essentially each protein is modeled as a storyline, and proteins interact and cause other proteins to turn on or off, and those are represented as these like arcs. And if the protein is off, it's not drawn. And so you can kind of see the dynamics of the system over time, obviously using storylines. This came out recently too. This was at Euroviz last year, and they're also interested in dynamic community analysis. And so each chunk of storylines that are bundled together represent a dense subgraph in the network. That subgraph is actually rendered inside the storyline, and then the links between those subgraphs or those communities are drawn to show that they also exist. But it tends to be the case when you do this clustering algorithm that you get basically connections between almost every pair of network anyways, or every pair of community anyways. So you basically see like all combinations of arcs. So it's questionable what the utility of drawing those actually is. But you can see that they have this nice storyline layout to show how things are moving from one community to another. This is a Sankey diagram. It represents flow. And so this has been around forever. I don't know when this one was drawn, but probably in the 1800s. You can use a similar Sankey-like diagram to represent flow over time. Usually Sankey diagrams don't have a time component, but if you do make this vertical axis, let's say vertical slices as time windows, so it'd actually be the horizontal axis, you can represent the quantity of things that are moving between groups. And so they did this for some eye tracking data. And the groups that you see here that are the colors are actually the areas of interest. So places in the thing that you're interested in where the eye tends to fixate, or multiple people's eyes fixate. And we're interested in that dynamics. This is also a really similar one, but again, it's a community detection or dynamic community detection algorithm. And they use this to try and understand a large body of scientific literature. Now, the one thing that I want to say about flow diagrams versus storylines is that flow visualizations are ambiguous. So if we have storylines that look like this, and we want to represent it as flow by counting the number of things that move from one group to another, that its representation would look like this. But this is ambiguous because this flow has also this representation, right? So we have more information in the storyline visualization than we would in its equivalent flow visualization. So just keep that in mind if you're having trouble understanding what the difference is between storylines and other work that's already out there. Okay, so analytics, that's the first major technical part of this talk. And analytics for storyline visualization, or in particular my approach, is about generating interaction sessions from arbitrary data. And we do that essentially with these three big steps. First step is to find the regions of interest. The second step is to find the trajectories. The third step is to find the behaviors. So since I haven't defined any of that already, don't worry about that quite yet. Just kind of keep that in mind to help you keep track of the flow of this talk. Okay, so we're going to start with the data. And since you were just looking at the VASS challenge data, this might look familiar. So the data in this particular case is basically these four columns. We have time, we have the vehicle ID, we have the latitude, and we have the longitude. We've got a lot of this data. And so the question is, how do we make sense of it? Well, okay. Periodically throughout this talk, I'm going to give some hints, some really practical advice about how to process this data. So if you're a data scientist, you might find this really useful. And you may already be familiar with a Python library called pandas. So that's what I use to process this data. And when I use pandas, I use the data frame, which is a way of representing this type of data. The nice thing about the data frame is that it will represent data that has a time component, and it lets you create or treat the time component as like its primary axis. So you can slice based on time and do all kinds of cool stuff. You can do that using the datetime index once you've already got your data into a data frame. After that, you can use a really nice feature, which I tend to use quite a lot, called group by. And if you do anything with databases, it's a similar thing to the group by in a query. So what you'd want to do here is after you have it indexed by time, you'd want to group it by ID. So you can take all the vehicles, whose all their data is all together in one chunk, and who knows if it's in order or not, probably in order by time. And you can separate it out by vehicle. So you can look at each individual vehicle's time series. Okay. So whether or not you use pandas doesn't matter, but when you look at the data that's actually in the data set, in the Mini Challenge 2 data set, you probably would plot it first, just to see what it looks like. And if you plotted it, you would see something like this. But this isn't very insightful because we just see roads, basically. Okay? So we can see, yeah, the roads are roughly perpendicular. Some areas have more dense concentrations of roads. Some areas have less dense concentration of roads. This area, it's not perpendicular. It's kind of diagonal. Okay, there's some noise in there. We should probably find that and fix that. Whatever. But this is not very insightful. And you wouldn't want to build an application purely based on this. And the reason for that is essentially, I think we talked about black holes and worms recently, and so here's a black hole, and I think this is very common, right? We're going to have this tiny little speck of data, which is what we've actually recorded from a sensor, but our models required something extremely structured and well-behaved. And in this particular case, that actually represents about 75 times more than the original data that we have. And the reason for that is because in the data set that we're looking at, we've got this many days, 2 weeks. We've got 45 things that we're tracking, and we have a 1 second resolution on our sampling. So when you multiply all those together, you would expect about 54 million samples. But we only have 685,000 samples. So what are you going to do? You can't just say this is intractable, we have too much missing data. So the solution is to essentially impute the missing data. So I think we talked about that earlier today, and there were some techniques that were mentioned. The technique in particular that I used wasn't any of the ones that were mentioned earlier today. And that's because this data has a special structure, which is that when the vehicles stop moving, you stop collecting data. So what we have to do is we want to use the vehicles as a proxy for the actual individual, and just assume that when the vehicle is not moving, the individual is at that last location that was recorded or nearby. This is just an assumption that we're going to make to be able to impute this data. Essentially, it's resampling with fill-for. Okay. So if in pandas, if you have your data represented as a time series, you can resample with a given frequency. Choose something like 1 minute or 10 minutes, so you get a reasonable number of samples. And then implement your own special resampling technique, which I call take last, which just looks at the last sample within a time interval. And then use a fill method called forward fill. So we basically are saying, look at the last location a car was in, and if we have missing data after that, just use the last known value. And then once you do this, you have really nice, evenly sampled data. And so we've filled in our black hole at this point. And let me go back a slide. Okay. So if you do this, what you actually see is that there's actually much fewer locations that are interesting in the data set than we had based on like the original samples. And you can actually throw out the samples that correspond to when the car was moving. And then you can kind of see that there are these like clusters throughout the data set. So instead of treating each individual location that's unique equally, we want to crunch those together. So you can do that with clustering. So this is the result of clustering after using this algorithm called dbScan. So how many people have heard of dbScan before? So if you've heard of dbScan, there's probably lots of other algorithms out there. Does anyone actually prefer to use dbScan over all of the other algorithms? Sometimes. Yeah, so under what conditions would you choose to use dbScan? Okay. Mm. Okay. Yeah, so the way the dbScan works is fairly straightforward, and I think it can be more interpretable than other techniques. So that's a really good point. The reason that I chose it is because there's a parameter that you can specify. It's like some epsilon, and when the data is two-dimensional, that epsilon has a real physical meaning, which is we're not going to put clusters together if there's nothing that connects them that's further away than epsilon. So it kind of enforces this common sense that we have about this geospatial data. But I kind of hate this algorithm because it's you have to tweak it a lot, and it never really works the first time. But that's just my experience. Okay. So at this point, we took the original data, so you can kind of map out this pipeline in the upper left. We took the original data, we imputed it to fill in the missing data, and we've clustered it to find these regions of interest, which are these broad areas in space that people tend to hang out a lot in. So the next step is to take our time series data that we resampled and actually replace all the GPS coordinates with those regions of interest. And this is a technique that you see a lot in eye tracking data because they're not really interested in the exact location where your eye is because there's a lot of noise there. They're more interested in the broad region of interest. Okay, that's a word on it. But anyways, and this is called a scarf plot. So when you create a scarf plot, it actually lets you see a lot of really rich kind of qualitative information about what's going on. Okay, so does anyone notice anything interesting about this particular plot? Or maybe have an interpretation for what's going on? I'll give you a second or two to look at it. So the time axis, we've just got days here, and we've got 2 weeks of data. So what's a common thing that you expect to see, or a common difference between weekday and week?
I see where people probably go to work and pick up their target.
Yeah. Cool. Yep, that's definitely one of the things that pops out. You can see that Saturday and Sunday are different than the rest of the week. You can see in the blue areas that it's actually not one blue chunk where people are at work, but it's 2 blue chunks separated by something. What could possibly be happening there? Right. Yeah, exactly. Okay, so this is really easy to interpret, much easier than the raw GPS data, I think, in my opinion. Even more so when you look at a smaller time scale. Zoom in on just a single day, and I'm showing 6 o'clock to 2100. I have no idea what time that actually is. 12-hour clock, sorry. We see these 2 blue chunks again, right? So let's just get bigger, but we get more detail. Oh, one thing that I forgot to mention was that the use of color. So we're color coding individual regions of interest. But if you remember back to the previous slide, which is actually that third mini diagram, we've got a lot more regions of interest and colors, actually. So that's going to be a problem, right? Because we've only got, and I think I heard this on a talk yesterday, maybe 9, 8 colors that we can use. 7, Russ says 7. Anyone have a lower bid? Okay. So, but there's not a lot of colors, and we're going to run out of colors really quickly. So what we want to do is just not be stupid about how we use the colors. That's probably the best that we can do. And so what I've done is actually assign the colors to the regions of interest that are visited the most frequently. Work, home, the bar, whatever. And then when we run out of colors, assign something neutral without any kind of hue to that. So that's the light gray. And that just means that they went somewhere, but we don't have a special label for it. Maybe if you want to put this in an interface, allow the user to change that and assign the colors manually, stuff like that. And the other thing that's important here is to have some kind of boundary separating these so that you can actually, when you have 2 light grays next to each other, as you do in this lunch area in the middle, you can actually distinguish that. If we didn't have the white separating it, it would just look like they went to one place. So that's my solution with using scarf plots. But the important thing to note here is that this is a visualization of the analysis pipeline, and so at this point, we're representing individuals as sequence of these categorical things, sequences of labels or qualitative states or something like that, rather than the raw time series, which is, XY coordinates in continuous space. Okay. So now our pipeline is getting even more complex. So that's not even quite enough, because this arbitrary sequence of labels is still pretty tough to work with. What's easier to work with is if we can take our data, chunk it up into slices, and go back into more of a continuous space again. So okay, well we started in a two-dimensional space. We went down to some integer label space, and then we want to go back to another higher dimensional space. That doesn't even make sense. You think you want dimensions to go down, but actually increasing the number of dimensions in this case is more helpful. And the reason for that is because we can start thinking about distributions of regions of interest, which I just call behavior. So what we do is we look at a day, or whatever time granularity that you're interested in. Okay, so we look at a day, like Tuesday, and we just count the amount of time that you spend in a particular place. And we come up with this bar chart or histogram that represents what you did that day. So what's one of the things that you lose when you do this? Any ideas? Okay. I know, it's after 5 o'clock, so. If you recall, okay, in the very colorful scarf plot, we have the sequence that things happened in. But in the histogram, we don't have the sequence. We just know you went to work, you went home, but we don't know what order it was. We don't know if you went to work every hour and home every hour, or if you were at work all at once and then at home. It's completely lost. That information is gone. Okay? But we do get a very nice summary of what happened. And so the idea is that we slice up the data this way, and we create these histograms, which we call behaviors, just for every time window that we're interested in. And I just have a second one down here, so if we zoom in on Wednesday, we can see that those histograms are qualitatively different at a smaller time scale than they are at the larger time scale. And that's because if you do this, people have different behaviors in different time intervals, right? Behavior across an entire day is different than the behavior in a particular slice. And I believe that violates this concept of ergodicity, but if there's a statistician here, you can correct me if I use the wrong term. But a lot of times statistics assumes it doesn't matter how big a sample you take, if it's ergodic, which is a nice property that's sometimes assumed, you get the same statistics at different timescales. But people are not at all like that. Okay. So the data scientists that are here, if you're interested, you would want to use the group by technique to do the time slicing. You group it by the day, and then you just add up the number of the counts of the amount of time spent in each region of interest to get these individual histograms. And then you would use unstack, because that helps transform the result from more of a stack structure to more of a matrix structure. You can come talk to me. I'll show you examples if you actually want to try this. Okay. We've added on to our pipeline a little bit now. So now we've got behaviors. And if we were to take all of those histograms and represent them graphically, you would see something like this, which is the heat map. And this basically treats everybody's histogram across every time window independently. And this is a great way to spot check your data to see if there are any noticeable patterns. Some of the things you can see, yeah, there's some places that are visited a lot more frequently than others. Okay. So once we do that, we can then apply clustering. So this is the whole reason why we went back into higher dimensional space. When you apply clustering, you can think about it as taking this heat map and reorganizing it to put similar things together in that visualization. But basically, you're assigning some kind of qualitative group or label to these behaviors. Each row in the heat map is a behavior in a way that groups them similar things together. So the only difference between the left and the right view is the right one has been organized by label, and you can kind of see, okay, this is what the groupings actually are. This would actually be a great interface for correcting the clustering algorithm if you wanted to merge things. Or if you saw that maybe this middle stripe here is really not that important because that corresponds to being at work, and yeah, who cares? Okay. Yeah, so I use a different clustering algorithm for this. I use affinity propagation. So how many people have used affinity propagation before? Oh, nobody. Okay. So the reason that I chose this one was because First of all, it's fairly unsupervised. It'll just run and will find clusters for you. You don't have to tell it that you need 6 clusters like you do in k-means or something like this. And it tends to work pretty well. The only problem with affinity propagation is it doesn't scale very well. So if you have more than a few thousand samples, it's not going to run. That has to do with the fact that it creates a square matrix from the data. And so square things blow up after about 10,000 or something like that on machines today. Okay. So that is pretty much the end of the pipeline. So we're back here. And so I just want to tie this back into like why we did all this in the first place and what an interaction session actually means. So we'll just look at this comic here and reverse engineer the interaction sessions from this so you know what the point of all of this was. Okay, so we'll go ahead and assign some discretization to time. So each thing is kind of chopped up into a little window like we had before. And the interaction sessions are just the things where the lines are grouped together. So these things here, I meticulously ruined this visualization with PowerPoint, so I'm sorry for that. But so do you get the idea now that like the interaction sessions that we had from the clustering of the behaviors is actually what we want to map onto this visualization, and visually they'll appear like this. So haven't discussed about how to do that yet, and that's next. So I'll pause here for a second and take any questions because I know there's a lot to take in. I must have done a really good job. Okay. Okay. So I've basically taken us on this journey that gets us from our raw multivariate data, our raw GPS data, to interaction sessions. And interaction sessions are the things that we actually need in order to draw storylines. But that's not the end, right? We're not just going to use some off-the-shelf algorithm to draw storylines, partially because they don't really exist, but partially because there's a lot of design choices here that you could consider, and they work well in some cases and not well in other cases. So it's actually really interesting to explore this. So the first thing that you could do is just kind of project the data, like some of the examples in the related work did. The second thing that you could do is take advantage of the fact that we have clustered the data and we've assigned some qualitative group to similar behaviors. So what we could do is actually map that to the y coordinate, and similar to some of the other research that I presented earlier. Finally, we could just create a true storyline visualization algorithm, which I call the aesthetic technique, just because it optimizes some aesthetic criteria, which I'll get into later, but crossings, wiggles, and white space. So this is what I refer to as the projected design alternative. We're basically going to take a dimension reduction technique and apply it to our behaviors, treating behaviors as independent, in order to map that high-dimensional space of behaviors into a one-dimensional space which gets encoded on the y-axis. The x-axis is time. Right? So normally, multidimensional scaling manifold learning techniques are used to create two-dimensional projections like this. So this is a two-dimensional projection of this data on the left. And I think we've talked about a lot of the issues that can happen there, so I won't really discuss it anymore. The technique that I use to actually do this, we haven't heard today, but this is a manifold learning technique called ISOMAP, which came out in, I want to say 2000. It doesn't typically get used too much in visual analytics that I know of. People tend to go for like PCA and MDS for whatever reason, but I think this actually works much better. So come talk to me if you're interested in why, because I don't think I have time to really rant about that. But in any case, it does work well in one dimension too. So let me go back real quick. So we can kind of see that there are like 3 branches here, and those 3 branches get preserved in the one-dimensional version as well because we've got these like 3 chunks here. And that's a nice property. And so all we have to do, instead of plotting this in one dimension, we plot that same thing against time in this direction. And so we get all these, basically we get a scatter plot. And I've redundantly encoded time so you can see these points kind of spread out from left to right. And then we just draw storylines on top of that. So that last part's not too hard. So yeah, I think that covers that. This is very simple. Just use an off-the-shelf algorithm. Oh, I forgot to mention that ISOMAP is implemented in a machine learning package called scikit-learn, which is in Python. So if you like Python and you want to try some machine learning, I'd highly recommend checking that out. Okay, so this is the second design alternative that you could consider. And as I mentioned before, the idea here is to put the individual clusters of behaviors on the y-axis, essentially by assigning them their own layer. And we can see that this is actually pretty different than the previous alternative, partially because of this overplotting that happens, which is either good or bad, depending on what you're looking for. So if you're interested in any deviation from behavior, this really highlights it quite well. But I would suspect that this wouldn't work too well for other tasks that require you to differentiate individual lines. Now, you could take this approach and separate those lines using another layout algorithm, but I haven't done that yet. So how does this algorithm actually work? We're going to start again with that same multivariate data set that was the behaviors over time and use those clusters. And then what we're going to do is once we have those clusters, we're going to build a graph that describes the transition between clusters over time. So every time we have a data point that moves from one group to another, we're going to bump up the weight of the edge in this graph, where the nodes represent the individual clusters. And that helps us model basically all the transitions in behaviors in our network. And the reason why we want to do that is so that we can then project it down to one dimension using a graph layout algorithm to give us a good ordering of those nodes. And basically what that does is it puts all the weight on the edges, or basically the space between nodes that are together in the same layout. There's a bunch of different ways of doing this. I use spectral ordering. Okay, so but given a graph, there's a lot of different algorithms that you can use that will take it and give you a good ordering of the thing in one dimension. And a lot of times problems will have many different names in different fields, so you might know of this as like block modeling and network analysis, or matrix seriation, or the matrix order problem, or something like that. It's all kind of the same thing. The point is that model it with a graph, and then you can use something off the shelf to solve this problem. And this finally illustrates exactly how this works. So we have this ordering. The numbers on the left represent the cluster labels, and those just get individual layers, and we just draw the storylines as they transition between those. Okay. So this is really the algorithm that I spent the past 3 or 4 years thinking about. It was a very exhausting exercise, and we'll see if it pays off. I'm submitting this paper today. But anyways, so the idea here is that we're not really mapping anything directly from the data to the visualization. We are going to run an optimization algorithm that figures out what a good visualization should look like, what the position of the things in the visualization should look like, in order to have the best or the fewest crossings, wiggles, and white space. So this is kind of more of a graph drawing technique rather than a visualization technique. Arguably, those are the same thing, but yeah, graph drawing people are special. Okay, so I want to describe briefly what this aesthetic criteria actually looks like. So going back to the Star Wars example, what does a crossing look like? Okay, these are crossings, right? When the storylines cross, this creates a visual artifact. But it's unavoidable, because if we had no crossings, we'd have all straight lines. If we had all straight lines, we wouldn't have anything interesting to look at. But at the same time, not all crossings are meaningful. Some are artifacts, some actually are important. So essentially, we want to reduce those as much as we can. The next aesthetic criteria that we want to try and reduce are wiggles. So sometimes the line has to wiggle in order to go from one interaction session to another. Sometimes it doesn't. And the question is, how do we get rid of most of those? And in this particular case, the artist has done a really great job at that. And so you don't really see a lot of wiggles here that don't have meaning. But when you actually run a layout algorithm, you'll find that you do produce a lot of these artifacts. So it's very difficult to actually reduce those. And then finally, white space. So white space is essentially the amount of space that we put between these. And you could actually arbitrarily increase or decrease these to create something that has a better or worse data to ink ratio. But it's generally assumed that you want to smush this down as much as you can because you don't have a lot of space on the screen. Or you could essentially use the space that you saved on other visualizations. So the algorithm that I use looks something like this. This is a really hard problem because it's actually a multi-objective optimization problem. So we have 3 different kind of competing things that we're trying to balance. And you know, maybe you would just take those and kind of weight those and throw that into some genetic algorithm and hope that it gives you something useful. I don't like relying on chance, so I designed an algorithm to actually sort of solve for this directly. And it has these stages. So the first stage tries to reduce the crossings in the visualization. I deem those as the most important aesthetic criteria. That results in an ordering of the interaction sessions, which is fed in as a constraint to the algorithm that reduces wiggles. That tries to align as many storylines as it possibly can. And then the constraint from step 1 and the constraint from step 2, or essentially the output of both of those, are used in the white space reduction algorithm. And the output is basically the y-coordinate of each interaction session. I think I'm going to sort of gloss over the actual algorithm because it's very technical, but just to give you a rough idea, the first thing that we want to do is model the entire set of storylines as a directed acyclic graph, where each node in this graph represents a storyline, or actually an interaction session. So it represents multiple storylines, and I've encoded the size here to show how many storylines is in each interaction session. And time goes left to right in this as well. So this is a visualization of the data structure, not a visualization of the data, if that distinction makes sense. Probably when you layer this, it's going to start out like this. The idea is to then flip as many things as you can until you reduce crossings. Right? So we can reduce crossings in this graph. That reduces crossings in the storyline viz. The next thing to do is to identify segments in this that we actually can align. And I've identified sort of the best amount of segments that you could choose that you could possibly align here. There are some constraints on what you're allowed to actually align, but basically, if you have a crossing in this graph here, in this data structure, you can't actually align those 2 lines that are crossing. Come talk to me later if you want to know why. The way to solve this is to model the edges in that previous graph with another graph. I like graph theory. So you model it this way, and then you want to compute what's called a maximum weighted independence set, which is basically you just go through this graph and you start picking random things that random nodes that are large or have high weight, which then means you can't use the thing that they're connected to. Then you pick another one that has high weight, which you can't use the thing that they're connected to, but that one's not connected to anything, so we can keep going through this process. Okay, I'll choose that one. We can't use those 2, but I'll choose that one, et cetera, et cetera. And eventually, you're going to have a very large independence set, basically a subset of your graph that has no edges. This problem is actually NP-complete, but there are good approximation algorithms. And we use this algorithm, again, to figure out which lines in the graph we want to actually straighten. There's yet another algorithm that you can use to figure out how much space goes in between it. That can be modeled by a linear program. And the best way to solve this particular linear program is through an algorithm called the network simplex, because this linear program has a special structure. It's less general than a general linear program, so we can actually cheat a little bit and get a really quick solution. And that's it. So that's how you compute the aesthetic layout for storylines. Okay, all that was like super complicated, and I guarantee it, you're not going to want to do it yourself. So there is yet another alternative that you could use, and that is GraphViz. So how many people have used GraphViz before? Okay, a couple people. GraphViz has this really cool thing that lets you render layered or directed graphs. And it also has a nice property that you can define what some like subclusters should be. And you can actually sort of use that to your advantage for determining the original the ordering of the storylines, determine what a good ordering should be. And the way that you would do that is simply by using the subgraph cluster option. So you can kind of see this gets you something that's roughly nice in terms of a storyline layout. Then after that, you'd want to take the positions that come out of GraphViz and refine it a little bit more, perhaps using the network simplex algorithm or another optimization algorithm. Quadratic programming is typically used for this too. Okay. So I did all this, and I have a cool demo to show you. But I think before I get into this, I do have some time left. I'll just wrap up real quick and say, hopefully what you've learned today is how you start with some raw data, multivariate time series, compute regions of interest from that compute these qualitative trajectories, then move into behaviors, which you can cluster, that allow you to have interaction sessions that you can render as storylines. Okay. So now the part of my talk that I'm the most nervous about, actually, is the live demo. So let me try that. Mirror the display. Okay. So this is my solution to the VASS 2014 mini challenge 2 data set. And what I've done here is represented all of the cars as storylines. And I think this was even mentioned today. I represented the employment types as colors. And so what we can see, actually, is in this top view, that there is a pretty strong correlation between behavior over time and employment type. That's probably the first thing that we pick up on. So you can click on those things, and you can see all the trucks here are behaving the same. Oh, this is cool. So in the bottom left here, I've got this geographical representation that shows you the trajectories. Each one of those regions of interest has an actual meaning in the graph, and so we can show how things move around through that. And it doesn't really make a lot of sense when you're looking at 2 weeks worth of data. I'll get back to that when you're looking at a more refined view. So security tends to kind of hang out together, although they do group together with some people from engineering. Engineering has like a lot of similar behavior. This is this is 2 individuals that live close by. This is another, probably 1 individual. This is another 1 individual. Yeah. So we can kind of see that we have a lot of sort of constant behavior when you look at this time scale by day over 2 weeks, with some anomalies that we can see here. Now, for the challenge, you're probably interested in the executives and anyone who interacted with the executives. So I have this feature that lets you expand the selection. So I've just clicked on all the executives. Now I have clicked on all the people who interact with those executives and throw away everybody else. And so we have a much cleaner view of the data. It's more relevant to what we're looking for. And what anomalies do we see here? Well, again, we see that most people kind of have this straight line type thing, but their behavior over the 2 weeks is pretty constant. But we do get this one anomaly here that does pop out. This is Isaiah Van. Now, if you are familiar with the challenge or the solution, you know that this character is extremely important. And what we can see is Isaiah Van is interacting with this entity, an executive, on Tuesday and on Saturday. And she also interacts with this other character from the security team quite frequently. So let's check out some of these. So what's happening on Saturday? So all I've done is zoomed in on Saturday. And so we're looking at this data at a different time scale now. And what we can see is that, where is Isaiah Van? On the bottom here. Oh, that's interesting. So Isaiah Van and a couple other people seem to be co-located in the early hours of the morning. Where is that? Oh, that's here. I think that's where they live. We can also see what else they did that day. It looks like Isaiah Van went back to this place, which is the Frido's Auto Supply. If you're familiar with this solution, you know that's kind of their hangout. Okay, so that's interesting. Another interesting thing that happened was it looks to be like some kind of handoff. So Isaiah Van was hanging out at these people's house at the early hours, and then this other person kind of stepped in and took up the baton here right after Isaiah Van left. So that's interesting. Okay, let's go back to the previous thing that we were looking at, and let's look at this day. Okay, this day is a little bit different, but we see a similar pattern. Isaiah Van is in the same spot, the same executive's house. Probably anomalous. And where is Isaiah Fan when she's hanging out with this guy? Frido's Auto Supply. So she or he, whoever this is, goes from an executive's house, again, early in the morning, immediately to Frido's Auto Supply. So you can kind of get an idea for this weird stuff that's going on in this data set. Okay. And I think that is all I have to say, except for thank you for your attention and thank you for the opportunity to speak here. That's it. Any questions? Oh, I should say that I expect the review panel to give me one positive and one criticism, please.
Any questions?
So within the STL, we're very interested in storylines. We've actually been working with supplier at the moment to develop a storyline visualization. With the internal using the same VASS data set. So really interesting today. Helping see how they compare. One of the constraints we put on there was there's use of the vehicle might be stopped. We specifically told them that you don't want to do that. So if we haven't got data, we want to visualize in some way that indicate that we haven't got data in that period. So I guess how have you done that? That changes the optimization significantly. Then what actually goes to the white space within your line.
Mm-hmm.
I don't really know that I've got a question there. It's just that
Yeah.
sometimes perhaps it depends on who's going to use this, but maybe the intelligence scientists you want to know that you haven't got data rather than
Right. Yeah.
other weekly, I guess. Maybe change the highlight or something like that.
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah, I agree with that. So I think it is important to show when you have real data versus interpolated or extrapolated data or something like that. I think if you only consider the model of the person where you have real data, then you don't have a lot of actionable data. Because a lot of times the person's not driving, but you need some kind of model that describes where the person is. So it goes back to that black hole where the problem becomes intractable if you only consider the data that you have and not the data that you could have if you modeled it a little bit differently. But it depends on what you're looking for. So if you're interested in driving patterns, then yeah, stick with the actual movement data.
Yeah, it does. I don't think we really get a general visualization tool like on the data sets.
Okay. Another question.
Sorry, I'm just working on the storyline as well because I'm a PhD student. My question is like, why are you interested about this graph optimization system? So if you optimize any graph, is there any chance of losing the connectivity? That's what I want to know. If we plot the storyline of different events, so is there any possibility of losing the connectivity of different events, relationships? If we follow this, so why is it important for drawing a storyline?
Okay, so that seems to be two different questions, which is, one, is there a risk that the visualization will disconnect the graph? And two, what is the importance of optimizing the layout? And so based on how the optimization works, the answer to question one is essentially no, you don't really have a risk of disconnecting it. I can get into the details of why that's the case, but essentially these interaction sessions are sort of constraints that you're enforcing on the visualization, and you can be very careful to make sure that you're not doing anything that would disconnect it potentially. The answer to question two, why are we running an optimization algorithm, is because if you don't, the y position of the interaction sessions is arbitrary. So you need to have a way of coming up with what that position should be. If you do this carelessly, you could have a visualization that's very hard to understand, has lots of crossings. So we do this with a lot of care by using an optimization algorithm, right, to optimize the criteria that we think the visualization should have to make it more usable. But that's actually more of a hypothesis than a hard fact. So we're making the assumption or the hypothesis that crossings, wiggles, things like that are bad, and we want to reduce those. But that's maybe not the case. So it's up to the designer, really.
Okay, think at that point I'll say, Dustin, thank you very much. That was